Hello, I'm Tara Koch, and I'm going to talk to you today about how to write an effective bar essay answer, which, as I will talk to you several times about today, is very, very different than your previous law school essay answers. First, I'll briefly talk about the topics and scoring, and then we'll go on to some key essay writing tips to help you write your best bar exam answer. On the bar exam for the Florida essay portion, there will be 3 essays. 3 hours for the 3 essays. They're on multiple topics. You can go on our Stetson Florida bar portal and see the various topics. There's quite a long list. You don't want to look at grids showing what has been tested too much in the past and gamble on what you think is going to come up this time. The bar, particularly in the last couple of years, has become even more unpredictable about what they're going to test. They also often now do hybrid questions that mix in 2 topics together, and you can bet that there's going to be ethics on at least one question as a third topic at the end, generally. They also like to generally test Florida con law pretty heavily as well. Your question will not be labeled nicely with a topic, as many of your practice questions are. It will be your job to figure out what major issues are being tested, and that will come with practice. There are generally 4 to 5 major issues per question. So again, being very different than your typical law school exam answer, the scoring is very different, and you need to adjust your expectations accordingly. 45 out of 100 is generally a passing grade, depending on how the numbers come out on each bar, but so a 50 generally is pretty good. When you're doing your bar exam practicing, you really want to aim, though, to get a 60 or 65 in practice to make sure you're writing an effective answer, getting enough of the points going forward. Again, an effective bar exam essay is very different than a law school essay answer. There are 3 key things to remember here. You want to remember who is grading your answer, how your answer is graded using a rubric system that I'm going to talk a bunch about coming up here, and what is in the call of the question, which is so very important. First of all, who is grading your paper? Put yourself in your grader's shoes. Think about who this person is. It is not your law school professor who knows you well, who you've spent a semester with, who can read your answer, and even though you're not getting it the point exactly, thinks you're close enough, or however that might be graded. These graders have hundreds of essays to grade on a very short time frame. They're essentially volunteers. They probably are averaging about 10 minutes a question. They're working in a very tight time frame. They usually have other full-time jobs, family commitments, etc. So they're in a time-pressured environment, usually grading in the evening or on weekends. They're overworked and pressed for time. You do not want to make them grumpy. So you want to follow these pointers to make your answer as easy to read as possible. You want to spoon feed your answer to them, clearly presenting the issues and your explanatory conclusions that I'm going to talk about by keeping your answer clear, concise, and focused on the key issues. Next is, how is your bar essay graded? This is also very important to understand. The bar generally uses a rubric system, which you'll become familiar with the more you practice, and hopefully using Stetson's bar essay grading program. Bar essay grading is an objective, not a subjective process. They strictly follow a rubric form. There is no discretion in grading. You get the points if you hit the blocks that are laid out, the language in the blocks on the rubric. There are generally 19 blocks of 5 points each for substance, plus a last block for style, which is an additional 5 points. You will get no partial credit. So on the substantive blocks, those 19, you either get 5 or 0. You will not get anywhere in between there. It's all or nothing, depending on whether you hit the point in that rubric block. The exception for that is style. Style can either be 0, 3, or 5 generally, but you can just bank on the fact that you're going to get a 3. 5 is very rare. If you do write poorly, you will get a 0, so keep that in mind as well. You earn points, so that's good news. Once points are earned, they are not deducted. So if you've said something right and then for some reason say it incorrectly later, you're not going to lose those points. You really need to practice and focus, taking a good look at the rubric once you've written your essay answers and what you got and what you did not get on those rubrics. You need to remember this rubric format going forward as you practice and are writing your answers. Learning how to hit those key points can be very frustrating. So as I said, practice is essential. I've gotten to the point where I've graded so many over the years that when I look at a question, I can see in my mind how the rubric breaks out. And as you start practicing, you'll want to do the same, thinking about how generally there are 4 to 5 major issues. They're going to be probably 20 points or so each. And so you want to stay focused on making sure you're hitting the key points on each and then moving on so that you can address all the issues, as we'll talk about further. You always really want to pay very close attention to what is in the call of the question. You must address all issues raised in the call of the question. I know this seems so simple now, but there are so many students I've seen over the years who simply do not answer major parts of the question, and they're leaving several points on the table. You want to use the call of the question also as your guide in organizing your answer. Chances are, if you're lucky enough to have a call of a question that is very specific, saying address points 1, 2, 3, and 4, those issues, you can bet that your rubric is set up addressing those 4 issues. And so you should address those in that order to make your grading even easier for your grader. So using the call of the question as a guide is extremely helpful. Some calls of the question aren't quite as specific. They may say discuss this or that, more general, but you can still generally see how the issues flow through the fact pattern and organize your answer that way. Also, remember, ethics is generally at the end. Often students are pressed for time or simply forget it. Remember to address ethics. If it's on there, it's probably going to be a good 10 to 15 points. I generally advise students to follow the call to the question as noted, but in your practice, if you find you do a better job by addressing ethics first, if you do see that on there, and to make sure that you go ahead and get that and don't forget that key issue, then that's the way you should go. Remember, keeping your answer concise and focused on the key issues will help with time management to ensure that you address all matters raised in the call of the question. So, keeping those 3 tips in mind, who your grader is, how it's graded, and what's in the call of the question, what are the steps to writing your best bar essay? First, you need to read the call of the question very closely, as I noted, and use it as your guide for organization. Then you're going to read the fact pattern very closely as well. I strongly advise you use your fact pattern, your literal question you were handed on the bar exam, and mark it up. Use it as your guide. Mark it up as a checklist, identifying issues and circling key facts so that you can quickly look back and make sure you're getting the facts correctly and check off those issues that you need to address. I strongly recommend that process rather than doing outlining in your answer first and then answering your question. It's duplicative, it's more for the grader to read, and often if you're doing it that way, you may have remembered facts incorrectly. If you're looking back at the actual question, you're making sure you're reading the facts correctly and interpreting them correctly in your answer. If you must outline, I would avoid lengthy outlines, and remember, a short checklist is the best way to hit all those key issues. But that being said, one caveat is if you're almost out of time on your answer and you know there are some key issues you haven't hit, particularly some key buzzwords, which I'll talk about later, get those words on the paper. It can be in outline form, even bullet form. It may be that there's a key term on that rubric that if you simply get those words on the paper, you will get those points. So after you've read the call of the question very closely, noting in particular if there are certain things they ask of you to directly answer, and then you mark up your fact pattern, you want to get right to answering the question because time is very precious on these essays. Those 3 hours are going to fly by. So how do you answer the questions effectively? Remembering that your essay answer on your bar exam is extremely different from your law school answer given your grader and your rubric grading system. Here's what you do. Instead of the IRAC format you'd followed in law school for the most part, I strongly recommend using what I call more of a condensed IRAC hybrid modification type sort of thing, where you make a clear and concise rule statement followed by a brief but complete explanatory conclusion. For the issue, you can simply first address the issue by making a clear heading on the key issue. So you don't need to waste your time with a full sentence saying the issue here is this. Simply mark your paragraph by the start with a key heading highlighting that issue, and then you can jump right into your short paragraph with your clear, complete, concise rule statement, which we'll get into detail here in just a minute, followed by what I call a brief but clear explanatory or conclusion, which I will also detail. Specifically, on the issue identification, as I noted, a heading is plenty. You don't need to go into detail, having a whole paragraph saying what the issue is first before you jump into it. Headings really help your grader. As you go forward and you have some essays you've already done, go back and look at your earlier essays, just for the main purpose of just seeing at first blush, looking at it after you haven't written it for a while. Is it easy to read quickly? Is it easily digestible? Can a reader coming to it for the first time easily spot the key issues that you are talking about? It's a really eye-opening experience when you go back and do that. Also, there's no need to present your answer in memorandum form if that's what they've asked for. You don't need to worry about that. That's not good style as far as what's going to earn you points on the bar exam. You don't need to roadmap it saying, here's what I'm going to discuss. Simply jump right in, answering the question, starting with your key issue heading first and getting right to the first rule statement and then explanatory conclusion. Remember, keeping that rubric in your mind, you want to get to knocking out those key blocks. So, starting after we've done our issue heading, going to our rule statement. Rule statements are essential on your bar exam essay answer. You need to identify the rule for each issue. That being said, also make sure you don't, as I talk about later, assume or allude to the rule by blending it with your application. Many of these rubrics have a separate block for a clear threshold rule statement, then a separate 5-point block for correctly applying that rule in your explanatory conclusion. If you just blend the rule into discussing it applied already, you won't necessarily get those rule statement points. So even though you know the rule, you'd only be getting, say, 5 points for the explanatory conclusion rather than the 10 for rule statement plus explanatory conclusion. Clear, concise rule statements, as I've said, are essential. While they're concise, they need to be complete, but you don't need to go on for a paragraph about it. Usually one sentence will be able to hit all those key elements. You do want to make sure you also make it compact, addressing all the elements quickly together in a threshold statement. For example, if the issue is negligence, rather than spreading it all through your paper, saying the claim is negligence, start with duty, have 3 paragraphs on duty, then go to breach. You're making your bar grader search all through it just to hit that one rubric. Make sure you got your rule statement. Don't do that. That makes your grader grumpy. Start with a key threshold rule statement. The rule is negligence. A claim for negligence requires duty, breach, causation, damages. Then go into each element, applying it to the facts to come to your explanatory conclusion. After that, you're going to go to your explanatory conclusion as noted. Note this is not just a conclusion. A good example is a trust essay I was just grading, where many of the students did a good job with their rule statement on the key 6 elements for a valid trust, and then quickly said, this trust is valid, which was the right answer. But you won't get your explanatory conclusion points for that if you simply say that without explaining why. You don't need to have a whole paragraph about it. 2 to 3 sentences on your explanatory conclusion where you're applying the rules quickly to the facts is sufficient to come to a complete and adequate explanatory conclusion. This, again, is very different than a law school answer where you often had pages and pages of analysis. There's simply not time for it in the rubric that's provided. You won't earn the points for it. 2 to 3 sentences as you look on those blocks on the rubric are going to be sufficient if you're on point to get those points for an explanatory conclusion. A lot of people ask me if you should argue and counter-argue. If the issue merits, yes, but again, this can be done in 2 to 3 sentences. Plaintiff would argue this, defendant would argue this, the answer is this. Boom, 2 to 3 sentences, you're done. If you're on paragraph 3 or page 2, still talking about the same issue, you have way past whether you're gonna have earned those points or not. Also, a quick note about conclusions. Answer the question. If there's an answer, say it emphatically without wishy-washy, probably, likely. Those wiggle words aren't going to earn you points. And if an exact answer, an emphatic answer without any wiggle words happens to be what's required on the rubric, you don't want to lose those points for not emphatically answering the question yes or no. So if you think you know what the answer is, just go for it and give a clear explanatory conclusion. So again, going back on how you're answering the question, you're doing a heading followed by a complete, concise, clear, and correct and compact rule statement, followed by your explanatory conclusion on each issue. Usually it's a tight little paragraph, a couple sentences each. That's where you're going to earn all those points on that rubric. Now I'm going to go into some additional tips. First, regarding the facts. Obviously, pay very close attention to the facts as I've noted and use them, but do not just reiterate the facts in your answer. I promise you, your bar essay grader knows the facts very well when they're on page or essay 350 of all those they've graded. You simply need to use the facts in your explanatory conclusion. You definitely need to use them, but don't just reiterate them. Use them in your very brief analysis, answering the question, applying the rules to the facts. Also, this again sounds very silly, but make sure you're reading the facts correctly. Make sure that by circling, you can do that, making sure you're getting those facts correctly. I see way too often students who clearly know the right rule and would have gotten it right applying it to the facts, but have, in transferring, reading the question, going to write their answer, flip-flop either parties or an incorrect note, saying a note was signed when it wasn't signed, what have you. Make sure you're getting those facts correctly. You wouldn't want to waste all this time studying and knowing the rule correctly and then getting it wrong simply because you misread the facts. Another key thing to remember are buzzwords and key terms, as I've talked about. Those are in an objective grading process. Buzzwords are going to be tested because it's easy to test and effectively grade in an objective manner. Buzzwords, everybody can agree if a certain word is stated on a paper. So those well-established concepts in your bar prep books that are bolded, terms you hear again and again, terms of art, of key statutes, law in Florida, you need to make sure you know those exactly and that you state them specifically exactly to earn those points. This is a frustrating and painful process to learn at first. It's very hard for me, trust me, as the grader, where I can see that a student is so close and may have just misstated something, but if you're not hitting that word correctly, you're not going to get the points. And as I do these practice essays, I really stick to that because you want to learn that lesson now, as painful as it may be, rather than making that mistake on the bar exam. You also need to know, again, this sounds silly, you also need to know what law applies in Florida and only discuss Florida law if, unless in the question it specifically says or it notes that it's Florida or federal con law for some reason. It sounds silly, but I see many answers that say, if this is the rule in Florida, or it just talks about what various jurisdictions do this, another jurisdiction does that. That is a waste of time. It also frustrates your grader. You need to know the rule in Florida, state it emphatically and correctly, and apply it. Again, if you're saying, if this rule applies in Florida, you're likely gonna get a grumpy grader. Some other no-nos to think about as you go through your practice in writing an effective bar exam essay. Again, this sounds silly now, but be sure not to assume or allude to anything. Don't assume or allude to rule elements. Don't assume or allude to key explanatory conclusions. Oftentimes, you go through a rule in your head so quickly, you've known it so well for so long, you forget to actually state it before you jump into applying it. You must state these key things in order to earn the points. One thing that I like to think about in remembering this key rule is calling it the grandma rule. It's very different again from your law school essay. You need to present these bar exam essays as if you were explaining the law and the answer to the question to your grandmother. Explain it in building blocks, making your case, starting with the rule, going to your explanatory conclusion. Very simple. Clear, easy to understand, hitting key points. Remember, you're having tired, time-pressured, overworked folks who are your bar exam graders with no discretion, an objective process. Make it very elemental, like you're explaining the law to your grandmother. Also, another side note that is often overlooked and seems silly, but if the call of the question is asking you what causes of action there are, state the cause of action. If there's a breach of contract action that the plaintiff has, state that as your threshold statement after using the rule and saying the elements of the contract, then saying plaintiff has a breach of contract action, then getting into your quick 2 or 3 explanatory conclusion sentences. Often students just jump right in, assuming that it's clear that there's a breach of contract action without actually stating that, and that may well be required on the rubric, and you've just left 5 points on the table. Another quick note, if the UCC applies, you should clearly state that as well. That's another one I see students where they think it seems so obvious and you're pressed for time, you just jump right in and you never have that threshold statement about whether the UCC applies versus why that may apply instead of the common law in that situation. Again, I would like to emphasize, do not spend too much time on any one issue. If the perfect actually answer, you can look at the rubric, it's one page, would be able to address all those issues in one page. Now that's pretty hard to do, but you really don't need much, 2 or 3 pages tops, and you're sufficiently hitting all those points in the rubric. If you have gotten to paragraph 3 or 4 on one issue, you are wasting way too much time and likely won't hit the other key issues. And if you were going to get those points on this issue you've already addressed, you hopefully would have gotten there already and you need to move on. Remember the rubric format and how brief it is. Another tip on staying clear and concise, do not cut and paste paragraphs from earlier in your answer. This again creates a very grumpy grader, and I promise you, if you've made a rule statement, you've already earned the only 5 points available for that particular rule on the rubric. It's not going to have another 5 points later on for the exact same rule statement. Now, you may well, like in a torts question, for example, with negligence, have various defendants. I see this often where you have to apply the general negligence rule in a different capacity with different facts on different defendants. When that's the case, you do want to cross-reference your original negligence rule statement, but you don't need to keep restating it. It's a waste of time. It eats up your valuable time and the graders as well. A couple other pointers to remember. You don't need to cite to statutes or cases. You will not earn points for those. Sometimes a statute does apply, like for example, for a family law, there are statutory guidelines on child support. You can simply reference that that's governed by statute. Sometimes that is required, but just saying that it's governed by statute is sufficient. Do not explain history or policy, and also don't use acronyms you may have come up with while you're studying. Another thing, I urge you not to make any commentary or off-point remarks on whether you think the plaintiff may be a jerk or something along those lines. Stay focused on the law and applying it. You don't want to add any commentary into your bar exam answer. Also, don't use what I call the shotgun approach. You don't want to just spew out every rule that you could possibly think of when it's obviously not applying. Now, if you're stuck on a question and you have no idea, you need to put some good thought into it and do your best at grasping at rules that may apply. But there's a clear difference when students I see who just are throwing out everything in the world, statute of frauds, this and that, when it's clearly got nothing to do with the question at hand. But do quickly note what I call parasitic claims or issues. Usually you want to go with hitting most of your time on the main claim that you think is the best one for particular, like say, intentional infliction of emotional distress. You would spend most of your time on that clear rule statement. I do want to talk to you about style points. My last no-no is do not rely on style points. That being said, you can use style, these pointers that I've given you today, to write your best bar exam answer so that you can effectively hit all the substantive points and your bar exam grader can find them quickly. Style points, there's 5 total available, but it's usually going to be a 3. If you write poorly, it may well be a 0. Just don't rely on your style points. Just focus on writing your best bar exam answer using these tips I've given you, and that will help you earn your substance points by presenting it clearly for your grader to understand. Also, avoid, as I've mentioned, long rambling paragraphs. You want to have short paragraphs, clear headings with short one-issue paragraphs, rule statement, quickly addressing your explanatory conclusion, and then your next paragraph. Long paragraphs make it hard to find the issues and read your answer in an effective, time-efficient manner. Quick note, I think most of you do these days, but you should really type your answer if at all possible. If you do have to handwrite it, you really need to practice writing quickly and effectively and skip lines and being legible. That being said, even typed answers, don't cram your answer all together. Even if you're doing multiple paragraphs, put a quick return in there so that the paragraphs are spaced out so that it's easy to see. And remember, a long answer is not necessary and is actually going to create for a grumpy grader. Pages and pages of all rambling analysis or issues that are way off point just make your answer excessively long, do not earn you extra points, and make your grader grumpy. Keep your answer, as I've said, clear, concise, and focused on the key issues to hit those rubric points. Again, a really effective exercise as you go through your practice is to put yourself in your grader's shoes, go back and read earlier answers and see where you're learning how to present it in a clear manner and where you need to improve in that regard. Some quick final notes for you on overall prepping for your bar essay answer. I really urge you to take advantage of Stetson's bar prep program, the essay grading program in particular. Since I graded, I am biased. The more you practice, there are 6 essays that we grade for that leading up to the bar. The more you practice, the better you're going to get at this. The more relaxed you're going to get at it, the better you're going to be at envisioning that rubric in your head and how those points play out. And that will help you so much more as you're learning the substance to effectively apply it. And remember to expect your grades to be initially low. You will hopefully see them go up as you continue to practice, and you'll get in the range of 60 to 65 as we talked about. One thing that we definitely learned from the February 2016, where we saw such a dramatic dip in bar passage down to 58%, that was the lowest essay grading program participation I've seen in the many years I've been doing this at Stetson. And I think that the essay grading program we have provides invaluable additional practice for you in writing an effective bar essay answer. That being said, the February 2016 topics were very unexpected. All 3 topics were topics they had not tested much at all in the past several years. So again, sometimes this can happen. If it does, take a deep breath and do your best. You know a ton of the law, and if you really look at it calmly, chances are you'll be able to logically figure out what at least some of those rules are and how they apply to earn some of those points. The bar doesn't want you to just memorize the rules. They want you to know how to think like an attorney. So in that regard, you need to be rested and ready so that you can handle these left curve balls that come at you and think clearly. Your chances of passing the bar go down dramatically if you fail your first exam. So you really want to put all your effort into studying this first time around. Think one and done. It's a couple months of painful effort, but you will be so glad that you put 100% effort into it so that you can pass this first time. No half measures, only full measures when you're studying. And how do you do that? I have 3 tips I recommend. First, accountability to yourself or using a buddy system. In particular, the Stetson bar prep program is extremely helpful for that. Second, scheduling. I strongly recommend you have a schedule and stick to it. I found it effective to treat my studying like a job, pretty much 9 to 5 hours plus, and then having key downtime each night so that I could recoup and refresh, spend time with family, work out, whatever helps you refresh so that you're ready to tackle another full day of studying. And thirdly, measurement. You want to really take a good look using measures, looking back at your previous answers on both your scores, on both your multiple choice and your essays, to hopefully see that you're going on an upward curve. And if you're not, by keeping track of that consistently, you can hopefully flag areas where you need to improve and add additional study time and practice. Also, as I noted, take care of yourself so that you're prepared to tackle the unexpected. I like to compare bar prep to a marathon. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You must train both physically and mentally. It's the biggest test of your life. You have a huge amount invested in it. You need to treat it accordingly. Focus and really give yourself some R&R as well. Put in the mileage, which is the work and commitment. Do spaced repetition where you're not just memorizing the material, but really making sure you understand it so that you can apply it. And then taper towards the end. Don't cram it all in right at the end. Take some time off so you're fresh to deal with the unexpected on your bar exam day. These are my points for an effective bar essay answer. I hope it's helpful, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.